Have you ever sat across the table from someone you trusted your whole life and watched them betray you right in front of your eyes? That's what happened to me. And I promise you, this story doesn't end the way anyone would expect. Hello, my name is Joanna Miller. I'm 56 years old, and for most of my adult life, I was a wife, a business partner, and what some would call the glue that held everything together. Before I take you too far down this road, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. It makes me feel like we're all at the same table sharing our stories. Now let me take you back to the night when everything shifted. It was a Thursday evening. My husband Robert and I decided to have dinner out. We didn't do that often anymore. Our lives were tangled up in work obligations and the constant hum of our small business. But that night felt special, at least to me. We had just landed a new client, and I thought, why not celebrate? The restaurant was cozy warm, lighting spilling across polished wooden tables. There was a soft clink of glasses, laughter drifting from nearby couples. I had chosen a navy blue dress, one I hadn't worn in years. Robert wore his usual pressed shirt, silver cufflinks, the little displays of pride he loved. I was ready for an evening that reminded us of who we used to be before life got so busy. I wanted to look across the table and see the man I fell in love with 35 years ago. But that's not what happened. Our waitress arrived, a young woman, couldn't have been more than 25. Pretty. With nervous hands and a polite smile, she introduced herself. And before I could even finish ordering, Robert leaned in, flashing that grin of his, the grin he used to save for me. "Well, aren't you a breath of fresh air?" he said, his voice dropped into that lower, playful tone. "How do they let someone like you work here? Must make it hard for anyone to concentrate on their meal." The waitress gave a strained laugh. She didn't know what to do. She kept glancing between us as though looking for an escape route. I sat frozen for a moment, my fork hovering above the bread basket. Robert carried on, oblivious to her discomfort, complimenting her hair, asking if she was in school, even brushing his fingers lightly against her hand when she set down his water glass. I can still see the redness in her cheeks, the way she looked down, quickly muttering, "Thank you, sir," before hurrying off. And there I was, sitting right across from him. His wife, the woman who had sacrificed her own career to build our business with him. The woman who knew the weight of every loan payment, who had spent sleepless nights running numbers, who had pushed him forward when he doubted himself. I sat there like a ghost. It wasn't just the flirting. It was the ease with which he erased me. As though I were invisible. As though the years I had poured into us could be brushed aside in favor of a cheap laugh and a lingering touch. I could feel the blood rising to my cheeks, my pulse hammering in my ears. Part of me wanted to slam my hand on the table to demand he stop humiliating me. Another part whispered, "Stay calm. Don't give him the satisfaction of seeing you break." So I smiled. I smiled so hard my cheeks ached. I cut my steak with slow precision, nodding, as he told stories loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. Stories meant to make himself look bigger, funnier, more charming. Inside, though, something shifted. I realized in that moment that this wasn't a one-off. It wasn't some innocent slip of bad manners. This was who he had become, a man so absorbed in himself that he no longer saw me at all. The dinner dragged on, and each time the waitress came by, he turned on the same act. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to take mental notes. The way his hand lingered on the tablecloth, the way his voice rose a pitch when he spoke to her, the smug glance he shot at me once as if daring me to react. But I didn't. Not then. You see, I learned something important that night. Silence can be sharper than any outburst. Silence gives you space to think, to plan. By the time dessert menus arrived, I wasn't just hurt. I was taking stock. I thought about the years I had given, the loyalty, the business we built. And in the hollow ache of that moment, an idea, no, a decision began to form. I didn't know it yet, but that dinner wasn't the end of my humiliation. It was the beginning of my liberation. And Robert, he had no idea that his little performance that evening would set in motion something he could never undo. That night, when we got home from the restaurant, Robert kicked off his shoes, poured himself a scotch, and turned on the television as if nothing had happened. I watched him from across the room, still in my navy blue dress, the taste of disappointment sharp on my tongue. I wanted to scream, but instead I just sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, my heart pounding like a drum. And as I looked at him, his profile lit by the blue glow of the TV, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Not anger, not sadness, something colder, distance. For 35 years I had been his partner. Not just in marriage, but in business and life. We had started from nothing, truly nothing, Our first office was a corner of our garage. I managed the invoices, answered calls, and drafted contracts while rocking our baby daughter's cradle with one foot. Robert was the salesman, the one who shook hands and charmed clients. But behind all that, it was me. I kept the books balanced. I kept the schedules tight. I kept the lights on when things got hard. And in return, I thought I had his respect, maybe even his admiration. But when I replayed that dinner in my mind, the laughter that wasn't meant for me, the dismissive glance he gave when I tried to join the conversation, I realized something painful. He hadn't respected me in years. The signs were there all along. I remembered the Christmas party last year. I'd arranged everything, catering, decorations, even little gift bags for the employees. When Robert got up to give his big speech, he said, "I couldn't have done this without my incredible team." He thanked the managers, the new intern, even the delivery guy. But me, his wife, his business partner, the woman who'd spent sleepless nights making sure payroll was ready, I wasn't even mentioned. I remembered the way he'd wave off my ideas during meetings. "Joe, we'll handle this later," he'd say in front of everyone. Later never came. It was like I had slowly faded from his story that night. I tried. I really did. I asked him softly, "Robert, do you think maybe you went a little too far with that waitress tonight?" He didn't even look at me. He chuckled, sipped his scotch, and said, "Oh, Joanna, you're overreacting again. Can a man have a little harmless fun?" Less," I repeated. My voice cracked, but he didn't hear it. Or maybe he did and just didn't care. He turned back to the television, the conversation dismissed as quickly as I had been at dinner, and that was the moment the seed planted itself. Not anger. Not revenge, something sturdier, a quiet resolve. If I was invisible to him, maybe it was time I stopped living my life in his shadow. I went to bed early that night, staring at the ceiling in the dark. My mind ran through every sacrifice I'd made. How I had given up my own ambitions, how I had bent myself into the shape of the wife and partner he needed. I thought about the business, our employees, the reputation we'd built. And then I thought about the numbers, the paperwork, the contracts. Robert might have been the face, but I was the backbone. I knew every account, every client, every clause in every contract. He strutted on stage, but I was the one pulling the strings behind the curtain. And as I lay there in the quiet of that bedroom, I realized something dangerous. He had no idea just how much control I really had. I rolled over, closed my eyes, and whispered to myself, "Let him keep underestimating me. It'll make what's coming easier." That night, I didn't sleep. I planned, and Robert, blissfully unaware, snored beside me. The next morning, Robert was already gone by the time I came down for coffee. Typical. He loved to play the role of the busy businessman rushing off before dawn, leaving the impression that he alone kept the world spinning. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug, the bitter taste of sleeplessness heavy on my tongue. The events of the night before kept replaying in my mind. His smirk, his dismissive laugh. The way he brushed off my pain as if it were a speck of dust on his jacket. And then it hit me, clear as sunlight breaking through clouds. I had spent years letting him write the script of our lives. Maybe it was time I wrote the ending myself. That thought terrified me, but it also thrilled me. I walked to my small home office, a room Robert rarely stepped into. The walls were lined with file cabinets, folders stacked neatly, labels I'd written in careful pen. For anyone else, it might have looked like a mess of paperwork, but to me it was a map of our empire. Every invoice, every contract, every bank statement, my fingerprints were on them all. I pulled open the drawer marked financials. The numbers stared back at me, familiar and almost comforting. I had balanced these books for decades. Robert never cared for details. He liked the big picture, the flashy outcomes. He let me handle the tedious parts, and because of that, he had no idea just how much power I held in my hands. The more I studied, the more I realized something incredible. The business was healthier than Robert knew. Profits were steady, assets strong. We had built something valuable, something that could be sold. Sold. The word landed in my mind like a thunderclap. I whispered it aloud. Sold. Could I do it? Could I take the business, the thing we had poured our lives into, and sell it out from under him? At first, my stomach clenched at the thought, but then I remembered the waitress's awkward laugh, my husband's careless smirk, and the hollow ache I had carried for years. Why should I feel guilty for taking back what I had built? Why should I let him keep profiting from my labor while treating me like an accessory? I spent hours at that desk pulling numbers, running scenarios. If I were to sell, I'd need to be careful. Robert couldn't suspect a thing. I'd have to move quietly like a shadow in our own home. That evening over dinner, I tested him. Robert, I began lightly swirling my fork in my pasta. Have you thought about retirement? Maybe slowing down a little. He barked a laugh. Retirement! Joe, I'm in my prime. Besides, you'd be lost without the business. It gives you something to do. Something to do. I nodded, hiding the sting behind a polite smile. Inside, I felt the resolve harden like steel. That night, when he was asleep, I went back to my office. I opened my laptop, searched for brokers who specialized in small business sales. Just research, I told myself, just information. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was already setting the wheels in motion. The days that followed were a delicate dance. By day, I was the same old Joanna. Quiet, dependable. The woman who made sure the bills were paid and the employees were happy. But by night, I was something else. A strategist, a planner. A woman quietly laying the groundwork for freedom. And the best part, Robert didn't notice. He strutted through life as though nothing had changed, blind to the fact that the ground beneath his feet was already shifting. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Nervous, yes, but alive. I wasn't just reacting to his betrayals anymore. I was building something of my own. And every secret phone call, every hidden email, every spreadsheet tucked neatly back into its folder. It all brought me closer to the moment when Robert would realize that the wife he had dismissed for so long was not invisible at all. I was the storm he never saw coming. The plan was forming in the back of my mind, like a house being built brick by brick. But before I laid the final cornerstone, I needed proof. Proof that I wasn't imagining things, that Robert truly was the man I feared he had become. I knew one dinner and a careless flirtation wasn't enough to justify what I was planning. At least not to anyone else. But to me, it was the spark that lit the fire. Still, I needed to be sure. So I tested him. It started small. One evening, I suggested, Robert, what do you say we take a weekend trip? Just the two of us somewhere quiet like we used to. He didn't even look up from his phone. Joe, I don't have time for that nonsense. We've got a business to run. Besides, what would we even do out there, stare at trees? I forced a smile, but inside something twisted. Once upon a time, he would have jumped at the idea. Now he dismissed it like a child swatting away a toy. I tried again a few nights later. Over dinner, I leaned forward and said, Robert, I miss spending time with you. We've been so caught up in work. Maybe we should have a date night every week. He smirked. That same smirk I'd seen at the restaurant. Joanna, you're getting clingy. Relax, we're fine. Don't make problems where there aren't any. Clingy. That word stung worse than a slap. After decades of standing beside him, of sacrificing, of keeping the machine of our lives running, clingy was how he saw me. But instead of crying, I studied him, like a scientist observing a specimen. The more I tested, the clearer it became. Robert wasn't just inattentive. He was arrogant. He believed with every fiber of his being that I would never leave, never rebel, never assert myself. To him, I was furniture, always there, always reliable, always silent. And that arrogance would be his undoing. One evening, after weeks of biting my tongue, I decided to confront him directly this time. I needed to hear his truth out loud. We were sitting in the living room. He was nursing his scotch, watching the news. I turned off the TV with the remote, holding his gaze. Robert, I said, my voice steady, if you had to choose between me and your pride, which would it be? He blinked, surprised for half a second. Then he laughed, a deep, dismissive laugh that filled the room. My pride, of course, he said, smirking as if he'd made a clever joke. Don't be ridiculous, Joe. You know me. I did know him too well. His answer didn't hurt me the way he thought it would. Instead, it solidified my resolve. It was the final nail in the coffin of our marriage, of our business partnership, of the illusion that he still valued me. I sat back, calm as a lake. Thank you, I said softly. He frowned. For what? For finally telling me the truth. He shrugged, already turning the TV back on. To him, it was just another meaningless conversation. One of my overreactions. He could brush aside. He didn't see the steel behind my words, the quiet determination settling into my bones. From that night forward, I stopped looking for signs. I had all the proof I needed. Robert wasn't my partner anymore. He hadn't been for years. And if he couldn't see me as his equal, then he didn't deserve what we had built together. The decision was made. The tests were over. Now it was time to move from planning to execution. And when I finally made my move, Robert would never see it coming. Once I had Robert's answer that his pride outweighed me, it was as though a switch flipped inside me. The tests were over. I no longer needed his validation, his excuses, or his lies. What I needed was freedom, and I knew exactly where to find it. The business. That little empire we had built from nothing, the place where every brick and beam bore the imprint of my sacrifices. Robert thought it was his kingdom, but in truth, I held the keys. I began quietly making calls, brokers, accountants, attorneys, all under the guise of routine business matters. No one suspected a thing. After all, I was the one who had always handled the details. Robert left that work to me, bored by numbers and paperwork. His ignorance was my camouflage. The first time I sat across from the broker, my hands trembled slightly under the table. The man was polite, middle-aged, with sharp eyes that seemed to read more than I was saying. "You're certain your husband is on board with this?" he asked carefully. I smiled. "We've discussed many options," I said smoothly, "and I'm just exploring what makes the most sense for us both." It wasn't a lie. Robert had always talked about options, though in his mind they usually involved golf courses and younger women laughing at his jokes. He'd never once considered what I might want. As the process began, I felt both exhilarated and terrified. Each phone call was a gamble, each document I signed a step further from the life I had known for decades. I hid everything in plain sight, files tucked neatly into folders Robert never touched, emails deleted before he could ever glance at the computer. At night, when he snored beside me, I lay awake rehearsing every move like a chess player 3 steps ahead. There were close calls. Once Robert nearly walked into the room while I was on the phone with a potential buyer. I slipped the receiver down, heart pounding, and asked him if he wanted coffee. He grumbled yes, and just like that, the moment passed. Another time, he caught me studying financial documents at the kitchen table. "Joe, you're always buried in numbers. Why don't you let me worry about the big picture, huh?" I smiled sweetly. "Because someone has to make sure you look good, dear." He laughed, completely missing the double edge in my words. Weeks turned into months, and the plan gained momentum. Offers came in. Negotiations stretched late into the night. I scrutinized every line, every clause. This wasn't just a sale. It was my escape route, my lifeline. Finally, the day came when the papers were ready to sign. I sat at the long oak table in the attorney's office, pen in hand. My reflection stared back at me from the glossy wood. A woman who had given 35 years to a man who treated her like an afterthought. The pen hovered for a moment. My chest tightened. Was I really about to sever the cord tying me to the life I had known for so long? Then I remembered the waitress's uncomfortable laugh, Robert's smirk, his words, "You're getting clingy." I signed. The ink flowed smoothly across the page like the closing of a door. By the time I left that office, the business was no longer ours. It was mine. And soon, not even that. The funds were transferred into an account under my name, only secured where Robert couldn't reach them. It was a strange feeling walking back into our home that evening. Robert greeted me with his usual distracted smile, poured himself a drink, and asked about dinner. He had no idea that while he poured scotch into Crystal, I had poured the life we built into my own escape. But I wasn't cruel. I couldn't simply vanish without leaving something behind. So I wrote him a letter. I placed it in a sealed envelope tucked neatly in the desk at the office he rarely visited. On the front, in careful script, I wrote his name. Inside, I told him the truth in the simplest words possible. "You flirted with a waitress while I sat there. You've been flirting with life while I built it. I took back what's mine. Don't look for me." Then I set the envelope aside, knowing the day would come when he'd find it. And when he did, the empire he believed was his would already be gone. The night I signed those papers, I barely slept. Not because I was worried, but because for the first time in decades, I felt something foreign coursing through me. Freedom. I had the funds secured, the letter written, the business sold. Now there was only one step left to disappear. I waited a few days. I wanted everything finalized, every transfer complete before I made my move. During that time, I acted as though nothing had changed. I cooked Robert's dinners. I nodded when he rambled about his big plans for the future. I even kissed him goodnight, but inside I was already gone. One Friday morning, I woke before dawn. The house was quiet, Robert still asleep, his steady snore rumbling down the hallway. I slipped into the closet and pulled out a single suitcase. Just one. I didn't want clutter. I didn't want baggage, literal or otherwise. A few clothes, my passport. Some family photographs that meant something to me, not to him. I walked softly through the house, pausing in the kitchen for a final cup of coffee. I sat at the table staring at the steam rising from the mug and felt no sadness, only relief. Before I left, I placed my wedding ring on the counter, not out of spite, out of closure. That chapter was finished. Then I carried my suitcase to the car, slid behind the wheel, and drove. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't glance at the driveway. I didn't give myself the chance to second guess. I drove straight to the train station in the next city over. Robert would assume I'd taken the car somewhere for errands, maybe visiting a friend. He'd never imagined me boarding a train with a one-way ticket. As the train pulled away, I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window. Fields and houses blurred into streaks of color. My chest loosened as though years of weight had suddenly lifted. I had chosen a coastal town Robert always hated. Too quiet, he used to say whenever I suggested it for vacations. That was exactly why I went there. Quiet was what I needed. Quiet and distance. When I arrived, I rented a small apartment above a bakery. The first night I opened the windows and let the scent of bread and salt air wash over me. I unpacked slowly, carefully, making the space my own with just a few touches. A framed photograph of my daughter, a vase of fresh flowers from the market. The next morning, I woke up at sunrise and walked down to the shore. The sand was cool beneath my feet, the gulls crying overhead. For the first time in decades, I wasn't Robert's wife. I wasn't half of a business. I wasn't invisible. I was just Joanna. And I liked her. I began to build new routines. Morning walks by the sea. Afternoons with a book at a little cafe where the owner quickly learned my name. Conversations with strangers who knew nothing about my past. Who didn't look at me through the lens of Robert's shadow. Every day, I felt myself growing stronger, lighter, more alive. There were moments of ache, of course. 35 years is a long time to let go of, even when it's broken. Sometimes at night, I would roll over and expect to hear Robert snoring. Sometimes I caught myself reaching for the phone to share a piece of news before remembering I had no reason to. But those moments faded quickly, replaced by something far sweeter. Peace. And back home, Robert had no idea where I was. I imagined the scene often. Him walking into the office only to find strangers sitting at his desk. Him rifling through papers, confused, angry, then finding the envelope with his name on it. His pride, his arrogance, his certainty that I'd always be there, shattered in a single moment. But I didn't linger on that thought for long because my story wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. And in the quiet of that seaside town, with the waves rolling in and the gulls crying overhead, I finally understood something. Disappearing wasn't running away. It was stepping into the life I should have claimed years ago. I had been gone for nearly a week when I imagined the moment Robert would finally walk into the office. It played in my mind like a film I'd seen too many times, each frame sharp with detail. He'd stroll in with that puffed-up confidence of his, expecting the world to bend around him. He'd nod at the employees, glance at the calendar, and settle into his chair, only to find someone else already sitting there. I pictured his frown, his confusion, his voice growing sharp. What the hell is going on here? And then the truth would unravel. The business wasn't his anymore. The papers were signed. The sale was complete. Everything he thought he owned gone. I could almost hear the crack in his voice when he asked for me. But I wasn't there. Only the envelope resting neatly in the desk drawer, waiting like a snake coiled in the dark. When he finally opened it, his hands probably shook. I like to think his heart skipped a beat as he saw my handwriting. So familiar, so careful inside. Just a few lines, enough to slice deeper than any argument ever could. You flirted with a waitress while I sat there. You've been flirting with life while I built it. I took back what's mine. Don't look for me. No anger, no accusations, just truth. I wasn't there to see his reaction. But I didn't need to be, because the beauty of it all was that Robert thrived on control. And I had taken the one thing he never expected me to touch: his empire. In that single moment, I knew I had broken him in a way no public fight or divorce ever could. He had spent years dismissing me, mocking me, treating me like furniture in his world, and now the very woman he underestimated had outmaneuvered him. That thought didn't bring me joy, not exactly. Revenge wasn't my fuel. What I felt was satisfaction, a deep, quiet satisfaction that justice had finally been served. Not in courtrooms or with shouting matches, but with a pen, a signature, and a carefully placed letter. For weeks after, I heard nothing. No calls, no letters, no visits. I knew he must have tried to track me down, but I was careful. I had chosen a town where no one knew my name. My accounts were secure, my movements discreet. Sometimes sitting by the sea, I wondered what he was doing. Was he raging in his empty house, drinking too much scotch, trying to charm someone else into filling the void I left behind? It didn't matter because I wasn't his concern anymore. I thought about the life we had built, the garage startup, the late nights, the shared dreams. And then I thought about how easily he had thrown it away with arrogance and pride. The letter wasn't just a message, it was a mirror. For the first time in his life, Robert had to look at himself without me there to soften the edges. And maybe, just maybe, he realized that the waitress at the restaurant had been the least of his mistakes. As for me, each day that passed, I felt stronger, lighter. I wasn't living for revenge. I was living for myself. Still, I won't lie to you. Part of me took comfort in knowing that somewhere out there, Robert had to wake up every morning and face the reality I had created. A reality where I wasn't at his side. And where his empire had slipped through his fingers because he failed to see the woman who held it all together. And that more than anything was justice. When I look back now, I don't think of myself as a woman who ran away. I think of myself as a woman who finally stepped into her own life. Leaving Robert wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing him for a smirk at a restaurant or a careless word at home. It was about reclaiming the years I had given, the effort I had poured, and the dignity he had stripped away piece by piece. I was 56 when I walked out that door. Some people would say that's too late to start over. But I'll tell you something, it's never too late. Life doesn't hand out expiration dates for happiness. Yes, it was terrifying. Yes, I still had nights when I woke up and wondered what he was doing, or if he ever truly understood what he had lost. But fear fades and regret fades too. What stays is the peace of knowing I chose myself. I learned that we don't have to stay invisible just because someone else refuses to see us. We don't have to shrink ourselves to fit into a marriage, a business, or a life that no longer honors us. And to you, the one listening right now, maybe you've been dismissed, overlooked, made to feel small. Maybe someone has convinced you that your role is to support, to sacrifice, to stay quiet. Let me tell you, you are more powerful than you know. And sometimes it takes one act of courage, one decision to remind the world and yourself of who you really are. So I'll end with this. Don't wait for someone else to value you. Don't wait for someone to hand you your worth. Take it back, because you are never too old, too late, or too invisible to change your story. Now tell me, if you were in my shoes, what would you have done? I'd love to hear your thoughts.